Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Unheard, a thoughtful discussion on law enforcement and communities of color featuring Terrance Carroll. Before we turn the time over to Terrance and Christine for our discussion, I wanted to give a brief overview of today's webinar. We will begin with a 25-minute conversation between Terrance Carroll and Christine Scanlan, who is the president and CEO of Keystone Policy Center. Following their discussion, we will have some time for Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question for Q&A, just please click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and type your question in the box. You can submit your question at any time during the webinar, and we'll read as many questions as possible. Please note that this webinar is open to the public and on the record to any media watching, and is being recorded and will be posted publicly on Keystone's website and YouTube channel. We encourage you to share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag Unheard and hashtag Key Conversations. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Christine and Terrance. Christine.
Thank you, Marcus. I really appreciate you helping to moderate this discussion today. And Terrance, I see you as muted. And I want to hear from you. Thank you. I think that's right. I want to introduce our guest today, Terrance Carroll. He is I told Terrance I would start with a proud Morehouse College graduate because I think that's really important to who Terrance is. He's also a minister with a master's in divinity. He was the first African-American Speaker of the House in Colorado. He's an attorney, currently serves as the Colorado State Director for Unite America. And important to this conversation, Terrance is a reserve police officer and has been in law enforcement in different capacities for many years. So I believe he has a unique perspective for us to understand. Terrance, I want to thank you for taking the time with us today. And I was sharing with some colleagues yesterday that in the more than 10 years that we've known each other and all of the work we've done together, I don't remember us ever talking directly about race. And it struck me that's an issue. That's an issue that we need to have those conversations and need to better understand the stories that I know you have and that you have shared some with me, but I appreciate the candor of our conversation today. As a former legislator, you have worked on impactful policy. You are a police officer. You're a leader in the faith-based community, and I felt strongly that your voice was one that understands all of the different perspectives and conflicts that we're currently navigating as a nation. And this really started, Terrance, when you posted online a Facebook post that summarized how you were feeling in response to the conflict that we are addressing today. And I'd love for you to share that post, if you don't mind reading that, as a way to start our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think we've known each other more than 10 years because I've been out of office almost 10 years.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think we're pushing 15 or 16 or something like that. But that's neither here nor there because I'm still younger than you.
Yeah, always will be, always will be.
Well, let me read this post, and I'll put it in context. It was a couple of days after the murder of George Floyd, and I kind of went radio silent so that I could, try to bring my thoughts together because I really was angered, and as the young kids say, I was all in my feelings about this, and I wanted to be able to address it with a step or two away from my intense feelings. I didn't want the intensity to go away, but I still didn't want to write out of anger and rage. So hopefully this reflects that. In the aftermath of George Floyd's horrific death, to which all bore witness via video, I've struggled to find my voice. This is not because I have no opinion or my voice has been silenced. I've struggled because I am tired of using my voice to mourn the needless death of another unarmed African-American at the hands of either a reckless, negligent, or downright murderous police officer. I'm tired of trying to reason with folks who blindly defend the indefensible. I'm exhausted from explaining why my people, me included, experience a very real and visceral anxiety whenever we encounter law enforcement, including the most benign encounters. I am weary from the burden as a Black police officer of having to explain my decision to wear a badge every time a peace officer, quote unquote, tears the fabric which binds us all as a society. I pray George Floyd's death is not in vain and that we've had, like the Apostle Paul, our road to Damascus moment, a tipping point where, as a nation, we finally realize the need for an extraordinary transformation in policing in my community. I've prayed the same prayer so many times in vain to the point where I wonder if any hope remains. I'm heartbroken any person is so distressed they feel rioting is the sole pathway to be heard. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gives voice to this better than I ever could. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions can continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, humanity. And so, in a real sense, our nation's summer of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
Thank you, Terrence. I found that post to be so powerful. I know I shared it and several other people have as well. What has been the reaction to your words? And as you've had some time to reflect, where are you now in how you feel and what you're thinking?
One, I think the reaction has been really positive from all quarters, not just my progressive friends, but friends that I have on the right and friends who are in the middle. They found it very helpful, and I'm thankful that they found it very helpful. As I continue to think about this and give thought to it, especially the portion about riots that Dr. King wrote about, I've seen where people quote that last part, right, as the language of the unheard, quite frequently, and explaining what's going on out in these streets, as I'd like to say. And maybe perhaps it's a justification for some of the people I call protest adjacent, who may be engaged in some illegal acts that I think most of us would not condone. Some people try to use Dr. King's words to justify that piece. I think what Dr. King was trying to do and what I was trying to do, especially when I talk to fellow officers and trying to explain the rage, is an explanation of the rage and why people feel the need to engage in some activity that we would define as being a riot. It's an act of last resort. And we have to understand that. And in a country like ours, where people feel like they have to engage in acts of last resort, there's a problem. And we can't fix it by saying they're just thugs, they're just looters, they're just criminals, they're this, that, or other, whatever negative thing that we attach to it, or it's criminal action. And yes, it may be, but what's causing people to do this? What causes people to feel like the only avenue they have left to be heard is to go out and throw a brick or go out and start a dumpster fire?
Thank you, Terrence. I know you are still policing. You're policing the protests here in Denver. Can you tell me about that experience and what is your perspective? Why are you can do this on somewhat of a volunteer basis? Why have you decided this is important for you to be a part of? And what role do you see that you're playing, and what's your experience been like?
I've been asked a few times, why am I as a Black man out there on the front lines of policing protests? And why am I agreeing to get yelled at? Funny story, I had a white young teenage girl yell at me that I was a disgrace to Black people and I was a traitor to the race, which I chuckled under my mask. over the whole thing, because I was somewhat shocked to find out that she noticed that I was Black. But beyond that, I'm out there because I think it's important for me to show the community that African American law enforcement officers are out there and support the message of massive police reform. It's important for officers of color to be out there to explain to our fellow white officers who may not understand why people are mad and enraged. And I've on more than one occasion during the protests, I've actually had to stop and explain to our own officers why George Floyd was a tipping point, why it's perceived that there's no trust from the community. And there really isn't. There's not much trust toward law enforcement at this very moment. And I have to explain why that's occurring. And maybe the most important part for me is I can't do a whole lot at this point. I mean, I'm not elected. I don't write laws, but I can do what I can do in terms of trying to create a safe space for people who want to voice their concerns and have their concerns heard in the halls of justice and heard by elected officials and heard by policymakers. And at the least I can do is provide a safe space for them to do that through my work in law enforcement.
Well, I appreciate that. I think you should let folks know. I think you told me you've been on duty the last 6 nights. Is that right?
That is right. I went to bed at 2 a.m. this morning.
You look good.
Thank you. It's my blush.
You look rested. I want to talk about, because you're engaged in the protests. You certainly have a background in politics. You're a keen policymaker. How do you see the combination of protest, politics, and policy coming together in a way that potentially could result in meaningful change? I think there's a worry that when the protests end, the momentum for change will be lost, and that this will just become another moment in the last many years of injustices experienced by the African American community in these ways. So what's your thinking on that, and what's your hope for change from this? Or is there a pathway?
I've seen so many protests come and go over the years, and even ones I've participated in, most notably in 1992 when I was a senior at Morehouse College. Myself and other students formed a group called Students for African American Empowerment in the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict. And there were protests, and there's some protests turned violent. But one of the things that we decided to do was that we wanted our protests to have meaning long after we left campus. And so we came up with a list of policy solutions, because it was all about police reform and things that were happening in our community. And so we came up with a list of policy solutions. Sadly, most never were implemented because we all graduated. So I think one of the most important things is that when you protest, it's not enough to circle around several times, which is important. Don't get me wrong, those things are important because they bring visibility to the issue at hand. But what do you do beyond getting on your knee? What do you do beyond laying on the ground for 8 minutes, 46 seconds? What's your plan? So I think when protesters they don't have to have specific plans, but I think a broad idea of what they want to see happen. And that's really important for the organizers, is to clearly articulate what they want to see happen. On the end of policymakers and elected officials, they have to be willing to be heard. They have to be willing to listen to the voices of the protesters and not just simply dismiss them as angry voices, because that's a simple thing to do, which has been one of my concerns when the news media started focusing on the riots and the looting. We kind of lost track of the message of the protests and the need for change and the need for dramatic change in how we do policing and what criminal justice policy looks like, not just in Colorado, but nationally. So we have to resist the urge on the policy making and the law enforcement and the elected side just to ignore the voices. Also, though, policymakers and electeds also have to resist the urge to enact reactionary legislation. I'm not saying there should be no legislation. We need some legislation to have more police accountability and transparency. But as you know, Christine, from our experience in the legislature, sometimes when you run really quickly to implement something as a direct reaction to something that happened, the whole Newton's law, for every reaction is an equal and opposite reaction, we tend to get it wrong, and we have to come down and come back and fix it. And so I hope that the Colorado General Assembly and other legislative bodies, both nationally and at the local level, really take a deep breath, exhale, and engage all aspects of the community, including law enforcement, including protesters, in terms of crafting legislation that leads to better police accountability.
Well, and to that end, when we are talking about system change, systems are notoriously difficult to move, whether it's education, law enforcement, anything that any area that is experiencing a need for reform. So, and there's been a lot of discussion over the years around how to reform law enforcement in a way that where racial disparities aren't such a driver to the issues that we're confronting today. And I think I read research that said in Black communities, there's underreported crime because of the fear of engaging with the police, even in a way where their assistance is needed. So there's a trust issue, Terrance, that I think you're highlighting, and I don't know how you rebuild trust, and I don't know how you engage in collaborative dialogue when there's such broken trust and such barriers to effectively having that conversation. Have you given thought to what it would take to build bridges and to start in a different way, a different outcome?
I've given a little bit of thought about it because at the police academy for my agency, I'm actually a use of force instructor and also an instructor on community relations or community policing. And so I've looked at it from both ends. And one of the things that I think is important is that we go back to the future. Sir Robert Peel, who's considered the father of modern policing, who really established the London Metropolitan Police Department, laid out these 9 principles of policing. They're called the Pillion principles of policing. And at the core, each one of the Pillion principles is that there's this notion of trust. Law enforcement only works if there's trust between the community and law enforcement. And law enforcement only works as long as the community continues to have that trust, because it's through that trust that law enforcement is empowered to do its work. And without community trust, law enforcement is disempowered. In fact, it's a very Hobbesian principle that, to govern requires the consent of the governed. And so it is with policing. Effective policing requires the consent of those people, of the community in which police serve. And it goes back to the protect and serve model that we see on so many police cars. And at the end of the day, I think many communities are asking for police officers to be servant leaders, that they put the needs of the community before they put their own needs. Yes, there are bad people out there that requires sometimes policing that's aggressive, and sometimes policing that requires use of force. But at the end of the day, most people who encounter police officers aren't people who have things going bump in the night, or who need to encounter police officers in a negative perspective where they're at their worst times. And one of the issues is that we have to find ways for police and for communities to come together in a shared place that's more than just a TikTok video, and more than just these random videos of police officers maybe running down the street with some kids or playing basketball with some kids. I like to see those things. Those are all great things, but sit down and figure out where the community is coming from. Why is there this sense of distrust, and not run and hide or retreat to your corner because you hear something that you don't want to hear. Engage in honest dialogue that pulls back the scabs of decades and decades of bad interactions and bad policing, and don't default to the line that, you know, there's just a few bad police that mess up the entire bucket of apples. That may be true, but as Chris Rock said in a video, there's some places where a few bad apples is not a good idea. I mean, you don't want a few bad apples. Just like he says, if you go to get on a plane, do you really want the bad apple pilot actually flying your plane? No, you want the bad apples to be as far away from flying your plane as possible. With policing, the same thing. Do you really want to have a few bad apples policing? No. So there has to be a system, and there has to be a way to remove the bad apples out of policing. And I think communities of color and all communities would be a lot happier if we could find a consistent way to remove bad apples, keep them out of law enforcement forever. And on the front end, how do we determine who the bad apples are? But at the end of the day, again, it comes back to conversations, developing empathy for each other. So I've already talked about law enforcement sitting there and hearing what the community has to say, which I think is the more important thing, without getting defensive. On the other hand, I think some members of the community need to sit down with law enforcement and hear the stresses that law enforcement officers are under every time they're out in the streets and every time they're out on patrol, and understand why certain things are done and why they're done in a certain way, so that everybody goes home safely at the end of the night. And there's disproportionate policing in communities of color. Don't get me wrong. I think all the research and facts bears that out.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Terrence. Shifting gears slightly, there's a lot of conversation about people wanting to become effective allies, and how to do so, and how to be authentic in that role. What is your thinking? What's your thinking on the ally question? And do you have advice or guidance that you would give people who I think have good intent but not necessarily understand a course of action?
I mean,
Or no action?
allies have always been important for people of color and marginalized groups in struggles for social justice, and they're needed, they're wanted, they're appreciated. But allies need to educate themselves before they dip their toes in the pool of the struggle, and truly understand the issues that they're going to be confronting. Allies need to be willing to check their privilege at the door, or just abandon their privilege altogether. And allies need to ask first before they engage. Ask where they're needed, what help is needed, and read. I think one of the modern problems that we have with people who are engaging in various social justice movements, it's not grounded in any thought. I mean, it's not grounded in any real principles. No one's reading, Sal Alinsky, for instance. President Barack Obama learned from reading that. There's no intellectual undergirding. That's what I'm trying to say. It's become very cheapened by slogans, and slogans are important from a marketing perspective. But once you get past the "I can't breathe" or "hands up, don't shoot," I mean, what do we have? What are we looking for at that point? So our allies have to understand the intellectual underpinnings, and I suggest reading books like How to Be an Anti-Racist and things like that. Or if you want to go way back, I think a seminal work on how allies can be engaged is probably Dr. King's A Letter from the Birmingham Jail. That's a crucial work that folks should read. And then I see this dynamic a lot on social media. Don't tell Black folks or brown folks how they should think and how they should respond to a particular thing. I mean, don't feel the need to jump in and say, yeah, and you should be thinking about this, Black people. This is also something you should be concerned about, and you shouldn't just limit it to police. Should address Black on Black crime. And I'm like, don't assume we don't think about Black on Black crime. We do, but we just don't. We don't have to tell you about it. And also, don't put on airs, as my mother and the old folks used to say. You can be an ally without trying to come in and seem like you're the most down, woke ever white person to walk on the face of the earth. We don't need you to put dreads in. Don't need you to wear dashiki. Don't, just be yourself. I mean, come with integrity and authenticity. And if you're Opie from Mayberry, and that's how you dress, keep dressing like Opie. You know, we don't need you to, you know, wear a Malcolm X shirt if that's not what you normally wear. Just come as you are. If you like fish, you know, wear your fish t-shirt. You don't have to change up for us, because it starts to seem disingenuous. So that's the most important piece, is be authentic and be who you are, and listen and engage where you're asked to engage. And if you're not asked to engage, stay the heck out.
Those are pretty direct words and advice. I appreciate that, Terrance. My last question for you, and then we'll turn back to Marcus to see if we have questions from people listening and watching. What does leadership look like in this time? And what do we need right now in order to bridge such terrible divides? You know, when I view to me, this moment in time is a reflection of the pandemic and the losses of life associated with that, the losses of jobs and the failing economy that we're desperately grappling with. This coupled with this, or combined with this endless history, it feels like, of racial inequity and injustice. And those factors all coming together have created this storm of emotional, it is rage, it's also conflict, it's also a feeling of desperate change is needed. But how does that happen? And what kind of leadership guides that in a way where we actually see something result from all that is being endured right now? And I don't know that you have, I'm not expecting you to come up with every answer, Terrance, but I would love your perspective on that, because I think one of the fears that I have is that this moment will pass. And then there will be another episode. And, you know, we will continue to stew in this endless turmoil of paralysis, not ever finding momentum for change. And I wondered if you had thoughts on that.
I actually find that an ironic question about the answers, simply because of the piece of art that's on the wall behind me. It hung in my office when I was Speaker of the House, and it was created by an art student at Metropolitan State University of Denver. And it's aptly entitled All the Answers. It's supposed to be a mock-up of a chalkboard with all sorts of things, all the answers written on it. And I wish I could just turn around and look at it and tell you what the answers were, just pick a corner. But in terms of what leadership looks like right now, I mean, good leadership is always good leadership. I mean, no matter what the times are. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of bad leadership right now. Good leadership, roughly, you know, and this is the Baptist preacher in me coming out, because my notion of what good leadership comes from my faith, and it's informed by my faith. You know, a good leader is someone who shows mercy. A good leader is someone who shows grace. A good leader is someone who shows compassion. A good leader is someone who shows empathy. A good leader is someone who puts the needs of others before their own needs. A good leader listens. A good leader doesn't respond reflexively or impulsively. Those are all the things we need. A good leader is the calm at the eye of the storm. Doesn't mean you don't have any emotions and you don't feel it, but you know that when, as the poet said, if you can keep your head about you when all others are losing theirs, it actually says, then someday, my son, you'll be a man. It should say, then someday, my human being, you'll be a leader, because that's an important thing to have. I'm reminded of a story of, and bear with me, sometimes I use biblical metaphors. During the storm, Jesus and his disciples were, you know, on a ship on the sea, and there's a storm raging. And his disciples asked, how can you, Master, how can you stay asleep through all of this? And Jesus very calmly woke up and said, because we basically know how this ends. Actually, he says in modern lexicon, he basically said, I got this. And I have faith that we'll get through this. And a good leader continues to provide hope to people, while acknowledging that we are in a bad situation. So I think that kind of leadership is what we need right now, and that doesn't try to find ways to shrug off responsibility, but a good leader finds ways to, one, effectively acknowledge their role, but also distribute leadership to other people, to empower other people, because it takes all of us in this ship, in this rowboat, to actually move it. Because this is a group effort, and that a good leader encourages collective response, collective responsibility, collective movement towards positive outcomes, and that's what we need.
Thank you, Terrence. I appreciate that, and I think there's a place for a lot of good leadership in so many levels, at the community level, at the city level, the state level, obviously at the national level. So I appreciate your words of advice. Marcus, if it's the right timing, I can turn to you.
Yeah, we've had quite a few questions come through. Again, if you want to ask a question, just click that Q&A box at the bottom, type it in there, and we'll go ahead and see if we can get it read. I've had a couple people ask the same kind of similar question, so I'll kind of wrap up a few of these and paraphrase them all together in this one. And you've kind of addressed this already, but what would real tangible solutions look like from your perspective? What are the indicators to the expectations that you would like to see that we're seeing progress on this issue in the near future?
And the low-hanging fruit part is, better police training. That's the bottom line of this, is better training, especially in de-escalation techniques and community policing. As the bulk of law enforcement training, when you go to the police academy, is around the more tactical stuff: building searches, firearms, arrest control, things like that. A whole lot of academics, but the bulk of it is, these tactical pieces. And, and there's not, depending on the agency, there could be as little as 2 hours of community policing and kind of less of de-escalation. The best defensive tactics courses actually also talk about de-escalation, but that's the low-hanging fruit. The other low-hanging fruit is, which not quite as low-hanging, but the next step up on the rung, is how do we evaluate who becomes a police officer? There are battery tests. I mean, background investigations, psychological evaluations, polygraphs, sometimes voice stress analysis, things like that are important. But do we need to reevaluate the use of those things to determine, especially the psych eval, do we need to reset that to determine if we're catching the right people at the right time, or screening out the right people at the right time? And maybe we should look at a different model for what a good police officer is. Maybe it's not the super aggressive alpha male. Although I consider myself kind of alpha, but it's different types of alpha, but I was kind of being funny, but maybe it's not that hard charging, crew cut guy. Maybe it's something else as we go into a modern era. Next thing, this is a benefit I think for law enforcement officers. Ongoing mental health evaluations for law enforcement officers. And I'm not saying in a bad way, mental health, to say, oh, you're crazy, so you need to get out the police department, you've seen too much. But ongoing mental health support for law enforcement officers, and to take the stigma away from getting that type of help. So I can tell you, my first run through in law enforcement, I was a full-time officer for almost 4 years. And one of the reasons that I left, because I thought I was going to make it my career, one of the reasons I left is that an officer I worked closely with was killed in the line of duty. And I just couldn't handle the stress, so I left and became a minister. I mean, talk about adding another kind of stress. You got people's souls on your hand. But that ongoing mental health thing. And then further up the line is, what does use of force look like? I mean, what force is acceptable when? But this is a thing where we have to actually educate policymakers as well about what officers actually face in the street, in terms of potential threats and why certain things are done a certain way. But we still have to address what makes proportionate use of force. Do we need to define that a little better? Is the use of force continuum actually appropriate for the work that law enforcement officers do? I could probably go on and on. Are body cams really something that's necessary? Some of the research says maybe not, but it makes the public feel better for officers to have body cam. And that's worth something in terms of creating community trust and improving community engagement. Citizen oversight boards. I don't know what those things look like in terms of it's going to be different from community to community, but those types of things. Maybe better reporting on contacts between citizens and police officers. But again, all these things, and I could go on and on, but the one thing we have to remember is this is not necessarily a one size fits all type of thing, because you have large departments that can afford to implement some of these more aggressive reforms, and aggressive in a good way, I will say progressive reforms, but you have small little mom and pop departments where there's like 3 agencies and 3 officers. And how do you implement some of this stuff when your entire budget for your police department may only be, $200,000 a year, excluding salaries, or in some departments in the state, it's even less. How do you do something like that in a small town like Netherlands, for instance? How do you implement these things that doesn't kill local law enforcement? Because I'm a firm believer that law enforcement should be primarily local. It doesn't work for people if you live in the Netherlands and you have to give up your police department for the sheriff's department to come police your community, because then you lose that community contact that you can walk down the street and talk to the chief of police or the town marshal. We need to be able to keep that.
Yeah, I actually have another question here that's along those lines. You kind of had that polar opposites there. On this question here says, and there's been a lot of talk about even defunding policing in many areas, but you're talking about needing more training. So how does something like that about talk of defunding help when we're talking about needing more training?
Yeah, I'm going to be very direct. Defunding police departments or police work is one of those Pollyannish things that I think people wish they could do. And the truth of the matter is we live in a society where we're always going to have bad people doing bad things. And until we eliminate the bad people doing bad things, there's a need for policing in this community. There's a need for policing for functioning democracy, to ensure that we're all playing by the same set of rules. So this idea that we should defund police departments, it's, somewhere it might sound cute, but it's not practical. It's impractical. And it puts people at risk.
We have a question here actually that asks about your college time. Terrance, you mentioned that one strength of your college protest was it was grounded in forward-looking policies. Have you seen that kind of organized policy making in this current wave of protests, specifically in Denver?
It depends. I've seen, for instance, Denver School Board member Tay Anderson is trying to propose getting rid of SRO, school resource officers, from Denver police out of Denver schools, and I've heard that in other places as well. So their efforts to do that. Out of the protests have come this notion that chokeholds should be banned. I'm all for that one, actually. In fact, my own agency bans chokeholds. I've heard things like that. Increase body cam usage, mandate that. If we can make it work financially or fiscally, that's actually a good thing. So yeah, there have been attempts to do that by the organizers of the protests.
Got a couple questions here about how it's generally widely acknowledged that witnessing the murder of George Floyd has been condemned generally by pretty much across the board. But there's that has a dichotomy compared to some people still may not identify that abuse of force is a problem. So how do you address that dichotomy of where people have condemned what they have witnessed with George Floyd, but they still don't quite acknowledge that there is a problem with perhaps abuse of force?
I actually think about this. I have conflicting thoughts on this, and I'm still evolving on it. I'm like, is it my responsibility to educate those folks who may not come from my community and may not have my experience about what's going on, or do I aggressively try to educate them? For now, I'm taking the tack that I will continue to voice and to raise the fact that this is systemic, and that you just can't blame it on a few bad apples. If it keeps happening over and over and over again, there's something in the system that we have to point out. We have to figure out what's in the system. And in law enforcement community, there have been people who've been talking about this. And the problem is we need to get those people in the law enforcement community together with people in the community who've been talking about this and have a merging of the minds. For instance, there's this whole conversation about whether police officers are guardians of society or are they warriors? Which mindset should you have? I fall on the side that we're more guardians than warriors, though we have to be willing to go to battle if things happen. If there's an active shooter, for instance, you got to switch to a warrior mindset because you got to get in there and stop the killing and stop the bleeding. But at the same time, day to day, we're guardians of the democracy. We should be guardians of the community. And I think a lot of protesters and a lot of folks who have a problem with abusive police practices and abusive police officers, that's what they're demanding. They're demanding, I know that's what I'm demanding. I'm demanding officers be guardians of the community, that they be empathetic with their community, that they be sympathetic with their community, that they have intimate knowledge of the community and the people in their community, and that people see them as being, or I should say us, because I'm part of it, but that they see us as people who are there to help, to assist, to protect, and literally to serve, as opposed to this warrior cop type of thing. I mean, cops shouldn't be, in my opinion, shouldn't be wearing the Punisher t-shirt from that Marvel, I think it's Marvel comic. And I tell guys in the police academy all the time when I'm talking about use of force and community policing, you wear something like that, you're siding yourself with vigilantism, because that's what the Punisher was. You're creating a certain mindset just by putting that shirt on that says, I'm here to go to war. I'm here to F people up when I get out here. That's not helpful. That's not a helpful way of policing. If you're going out to look for trouble, if trouble comes to you, you handle it. But if you're going out there with the sole mindset, I'm looking for someone to bust up, that's a different issue.
Along those lines, kind of talked about the systemic culture. Someone may come in wanting may not have a certain viewpoint or inclination to abuse power, but is there a concern that culture within a law enforcement or a particular law enforcement or area turns people into having that kind of outlook?
There are some aspects of law enforcement culture that aren't healthy. Think about it, that, cops, me included, we're in an environment where there's some massive distrust. And then you think that the only people who understand what you're going through are the people who do what you do. And therefore, it creates a closed loop. It's not unusual. It's not something that's unique to cops. Think about all the cultural groups that we're all involved in, all the societal groups that we're all involved in. We sometimes, get this group think mentality, or this echo chamber. And for most places, it's not necessary. It doesn't have any negative impacts on other people, unless you're in a white supremacist group or you're in an anarchist group where, you just feed on each other. But when you're in law enforcement or some public safety capacity, if you don't have other inputs that come in there that broaden your understanding of the rest of the world that you're dealing with, that's problematic. And that's, one of the things with law enforcement. So a unique law enforcement culture per se is not bad. What is bad is a unique law enforcement culture that is impervious to change or impervious to outside inputs.
Yeah, we actually have a couple questions along those lines that are along this conversation. Could we, here's one, could we engage in some sort of customer feedback after police engagement, such as from cars being pulled over, like an exit service? So I think that's kind of like what you're talking about. Is there some system set up for that, or is there any way to engage in that?
I mean, under Colorado law, an officer, if he detains you, and I'm not getting it quite right. One, all officers have to carry their business cards with their badge number and a phone number to reach their police department. And after certain types of stops under Colorado law, the police department has to give you, the officer has to give you their card after they've had a contact with you, which is the idea of creating some type of customer feedback. The issue is that just like Yelp generally, the folks who go on Yelp and give reviews are generally negative reviews because they had a bad encounter. So we have to find a way to encourage people who've had positive encounters to register those encounters as well. So yeah, there should be some type of feedback loop that officers can learn from, or I mean, both on the negative side and learn from on the positive side. And say, hey, you did this right. Keep doing this right here the right way.
One question here I really liked. In your opinion, if there were more women in law enforcement, would that help change the culture in a positive way?
Having more, I mean, I think studies have shown, at least anecdotally, that having more women anywhere improves the culture. And I'm not just, trying to find a date. It's just the way it is, because this has been years ago, so I'm not sure if it's still true, or it's probably still true, but where I could find information, there's talk that female officers tend to de-escalate better and tend to not rush into crazy as quickly as their male counterparts, especially younger officers. It's also a benefit of having more people of color in law enforcement as well, and not just random people of color, but people of color who come from the communities that we're serving, who actually understand the dynamics of certain areas, and how people live there, and why they live that way, and what the social stressors are that they live under each day.
I think we got one last question, and then we'll turn it over back to you, Christine, for some final thoughts. One last question here is, you talked about the bad apples earlier. Is there any concern about institutional practices that are in place that protect the bad apples?
I might get myself in trouble here, but there are institutional things in place, and some of them are appropriate. For instance, due process rights are important. Especially if you're a public servant, I think public servants should have some type of due process rights. And there should be some certain triggers where due process can be speed along, or there's some egregious act like you murder someone where, yeah, you really should go right now. You're out the door, bye-bye. But I think police unions have to bear some responsibility for protecting bad cops. And, and progressives are always, as a group I call myself a pragmatic progressive. We find ourselves, because of our general support for unions, having a hard time speaking out about some of the more negative aspects of unions, especially public safety unions and their role of protecting bad officers.
All right.
Just saw it in Minneapolis. Even the national FOP condemned the George Floyd murder, but yet the president of the Minneapolis Police Department Union just came out yesterday and said, heck, I've shot 4 people and I don't feel bad about it. I mean, are you that inhuman? Seriously.
Yeah.
I feel bad when I have to arrest somebody, even when I arrest someone, they've earned it. I feel bad about the fact, geez, you got to go to jail tonight. And I don't let them know that when I'm out there doing it, but I go home and say, was there a way for me to avoid arresting them? Is there something else I could have done? I always evaluate my own actions to see if I could have done something better, if there was an outcome that wasn't the best outcome. And I don't think arresting someone is always the most positive outcome.
I think that's all the questions that we have. Christine, I'll turn it back over to you and Terrence for some final thoughts.
Thank you, Marcus, and I appreciate you helping to moderate what is our virtual conversation. Terrance, I hope we get to have this conversation together in person. I hope that this is not the only opportunity we have to talk about these issues. I think I started this conversation by saying you and I had never directly discussed race. And I think I assumed I knew a lot about you, and so appreciate you. But it's important that we hear and learn. And I want to thank you. You're a Keystone board member, which is awesome. So I get the opportunity to have great conversations with you still. One of our other board members yesterday said it's not something along the lines of, it's not that what we have endured, which has been so difficult in these times. It's the learning that we have to do that is sometimes painful. And I think that's right. But without that pain, it isn't real. We won't see anything real and lasting result from this. And there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain in our world today. So I want to thank you for spending part of your morning. I know I know you're exhausted. I've in talking with you, I know how much you're working, and so appreciate you spending a little bit of your free time with us. But any closing thoughts, any final reflections? What do where do you think this goes? You're obviously signed on for more duty with the Denver police going forward, assuming there's further protests. What do you think the trajectory is from here?
The past few nights, the protests have been, first I'll talk about what I'm seeing in the streets. The past few nights, the protests have been peaceful. And I think organizers, as we've seen around the country, are doing a much better job of pushing out those folks who are just there to cause chaos and disrupt the message that's that they're putting out there, that's being heard. And I hope it continues to be heard. In terms of the race aspect of this, one of the most important things, not just white allies or people who want to be allies, but those conservative folks who make this false dichotomy that you're either with police or against police. I hope they hear the message that you can be pro-police and against police abuse, or against police abuse. I was like, my brain didn't work right there. But those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and that they understand that when the vast majority of us call out bad police behavior, it's not because we think police officers are bad, or as a group, or that that we don't need police departments, or that they're pigs, or whatever else you want to call them. It's because if you're a public servant, and I've been in public service in some form for a long time, you sign up to be second guessed. You sign up to be held accountable by the people. You sign up to be transparent to the people. That's part of the job if you serve the public. It's a unique position of public trust that we give not only law enforcement, but all people who are in public service. They're granted public trust to do the jobs that they do. And police work is even more important because we grant police officers the power to carry weapons and to engage people and to use deadly force when necessary. And so public trust is even more important. On the race side, folks who think that we're beyond racism, and this nation as a whole, need to have very direct conversations about the impact that race has played on the creation of this country and the building of the systems in this country and the structures that we have in this country, and not run away from the hard conversations. That's why I believe that we haven't made as much progress as we think we have, because we still are afraid to have those very tough and direct conversations with people around race, and to a certain degree class and gender and all those ism things. But for right now, we're talking about race. And it requires direct conversations where we say to someone, when you do this, it makes me feel like this, and this is why this is problematic for me. And not be afraid to have those conversations, and not be afraid to hear tough things from each other. So I think this is a tipping point. I think we'll be able to, I'm an eternal optimist, eternal hope person. You know, my faith teaches me to have hope. So I think we'll move forward, I hope, in a more hopeful and positive direction.
Thank you, Terrence. I share your hope. And I believe my faith is in actually the good intent of people, and in a willingness to learn at this point in time. And I'm seeing that in a lot of different ways, and I hope it can be sustained. And it's people like you who can help continue the conversation in the right way. So very much appreciate you. I want you to take care of yourself.
I'm going to take a nap at some point today and work out.
I think those are both really healthy things for you to do, and I hope we get to see one another soon. I do miss you, but be safe. Be safe out there, Terrence.
Thank you, I will.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Terrific conversation. And Marcus, do you want to let folks know how they can access this later?
Just, last final thought here. Christine, Terrence, thank you. Great, wonderful, insightful, and important conversation. And thanks to all those who joined us today and submitted questions. As I mentioned earlier, our plan is to post this recording on the website, keystone.org, and Keystone Policy Center YouTube channel. Hopefully we don't have any operator error, but that's our plan, is to post this on the website. Thanks again to all of you who have participated, and thank you and have a great day.